Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Ninsel, host of AZ Illustrated Politics, our weekly commentary and analysis of local, state, and national news. On tonight's show, state lawmakers may have a budget and the end of the legislative session may be in sight. Plus, Pima County wants voters to approve $22 million in bonds for a new animal care center, and the city of Tucson is moving closer to helping a downtown developer build a hotel. All that and much more is coming up on AZ Illustrated Politics, but first, a look at today's top stories.
The Arizona Supreme Court refused to hear a case this morning on the state's program granting vouchers to students with disabilities. That means a lower court ruling finding the Arizona Empowerment Scholarships constitutional stands. The program was challenged by a handful of school districts, teachers, and school officials. Last year, the legislature broadened the voucher program to include children attending D and F schools in addition to disabled children. State lawmakers this year are trying to further expand the program to include the children of public safety workers and military veterans. Veterans looking to enroll at Pima Community College won't be able to pay for their education with education benefits for at least the next 2 months. The Arizona Department of Veterans Services imposed the penalty due to the college's poor record keeping for students who receive veteran education benefits. Other violations included the school's failure to notify the VA of changes that affected the amount of payment to beneficiaries, failure to ensure that veteran students are enrolled in approved programs, and failure to maintain a record of veterans' previous education and training. Federal rules on educational aid to veterans require schools to notify the VA when students quit, flunk out, or take courses that aren't approved programs of study. This is the second year in a row that the VA cited PCC for the same violations. And Pima, Pinal, Cochise, and Santa Cruz counties are all now considered in extreme drought situations. And that's a look at tonight's headline.
I'm Judy Woodruff. On the next News Hour, Margaret Warner's latest report from Ukraine. Plus, Shields and Brooks on the week's news. That's Friday on the PBS NewsHour.
Tonight, Arizona Week with Lorraine Rivera reports from Yuma about recent unemployment rates and growth in the region. What are the city's future economic prospects? That's tonight at 8:30 on PBS 6.
This week, state lawmakers moved quickly to unveil a budget proposal for this upcoming fiscal year. Here to talk about the latest from the state capitol, Arizona Daily Star columnist Sarah Garrett-Gasson, former state lawmaker Frank Antinori, and Pima County Democratic Party Latino Caucus Chairman Vince Verbago. Thank you all for joining me here today. Frank, let's start with you. We saw some changes to the Senate version of this budget. They added some more money in for the Common Cause testing program, some more money for the new agency that's supposed to replace CPS, and some other priorities. Is this something that Governor Brewer is likely to sign?
The rumor has it is that was a negotiated Cal amendment series that were put in there at request of the governor and her staff. So if that's true, then if she had input on those Cal amendments to mark up the budget with those additions you just spoke of, yeah, I think she'd be more likely to sign the budget. And what I'm hearing from the guys in the House is they're upset because both the governor's budget and now the Senate budget are structurally imbalanced based on the JLBC baseline. The Senate budget is $400 million in the red, and the governor's budget is $600 million in the red. And the conservatives of the House want a balanced budget. You know, we had balanced budgets for 2 years, and then that quickly went away last year with the budget. Last year, that was $300+ million in the red. This year, they're looking at a $400 million plus deficit based on the JLBC baseline. So the guys in the House want to cut, and they don't want the money in there, from what I'm hearing. They're not happy that Biggs is a big spender and ran a budget through the Senate that actually is not a truly balanced budget.
I guess we'll see what happens in the House next week. But Sarah, what are your sources telling you about the key portions of this budget?
I think what I'm hearing is that people aren't on the Democratic side, and people concerned with child welfare, child protective services, and what it's now called, and the education community are not satisfied with how this is turning out, because while the governor set a benchmark, the budget they came up with the Senate, and her spokesman is saying that she's not entirely signed off on this. There are still things that she wants, that it's less, and it's not going to go far enough with child welfare protection, public education, that there's increases, but it's not what the people I'm talking to are looking for.
Is that what you're hearing from the Democrats too, Vince?
That's absolutely correct. It doesn't go far enough to protect children. Even the governor's own numbers, what she said would be the base level amount was $21 million. This budget provides, I think, $15 million. And we still see the abysmal failure that CPS is and has become, and the failure at the top. There's a lot of hardworking social service workers out there, but there's been no accountability at the top, no accountability for the agency as a whole, and even the governor. She shirked her duty in the sense by saying we're going to just create something different and do something different. And really, they're just sort of pushing it downfield. They've not addressed that. So I think it's been a failure, and I'd have to also criticize Mr. Tobin from the House of Representatives, because it's his constitutional duty on the House of Representatives to present a budget. Hasn't done so because he's off running for Congress. And so you have the Senate presenting this budget and negotiating with the governor, and they're basically going to squeeze him out. He's going to agree to whatever they want because he just wants to be out and running for Congress.
And Sarah, what about the whole CPS question? I mean, it started off this session with this call to create a new version of CPS. We haven't seen many details on that. There's no legislation about creating that. Now I'm hearing they may wrap up the budget, wrap up the session, and then come back in May or later on down the year and do a special session to deal with the CPS.
Well, CPS, and it's now called not Child Protective Services, it's its own.
It's called CPS 2.0.
Yes, CPS 2.0. It certainly is an issue that deserves special attention, deserves undivided attention, and I think they could come back for a special session. If the governor doesn't get what she wants in this budget coming up, I can see that happening. And I think it's something that we also need to look at, though, in the context of the whole budget process, because we don't have money or enough money to increase child care subsidies. There's still like 6,600 families on the list for child care subsidies, and that ties directly to child neglect, and also with unemployment, because if your choice is you need to go to work, but do you leave your children at home if you can't afford childcare? It's all these things are all tied up, and you can't look at it just separate silos. But that being said, I do think that we could see some action specifically on child welfare in the future.
Frank, how about that? Are we going to leave the CPS thing unsettled here
Well,
and then come
both,
back to it
both
later?
the Speaker and the President had asked the governor for an architecture for this new agency, and they're kind of, and that was the reason Biggs originally wasn't willing to put a bunch of money in the budget for CPS, because he didn't know what it was going to look like. He didn't want to write a blank check for an agency that nobody knew what it was going to be. Basically formulated with the number of folks working it, the structure, the accountability. None of that was there, and I think that that's being done right now. I think the governor and her folks are working on what they see as their vision for CPS, and I think as those details come out, you'll see the legislature more willing to put funding to fund that agency. And make sure the checks and balances are in there that weren't there with the previous one. That, when I was up there with Jonathan Payton, that was always an issue. I dealt with CPS issues weekly up there, and it was always a problem. So I think as that new agency comes out, they'll come back in a special session. They'll have more facts. They'll be able to see what it's going to cost, what that structure is, FTEs and costs and expenses, and they'll have a session to fund it and hopefully properly staff it and make it better than it is now. You can't go down. As far as I could tell, it's the only way to go is up.
And what about Sarah's concerns here about these programs for children, the subsidized daycare and the like?
Yeah, I've never been a big fan of subsidized daycare. I was an enlisted guy in the Army. Both my wife and I, at the time, were in the military together. When my wife got pregnant, she left the military and she became a stay-at-home mom. I was making $24,000 a year. I found a way to make it work. My wife stayed home, raised my kids. I don't think it's right to outsource kids, particularly most of the time to the government to raise your kids, whether it's pre-K or early childhood education or even some other form. The Democrats want nothing more than to take kids away from parents so they can indoctrinate them as early as possible.
That is just absolutely
Come on, Sarah,
a ridiculous
it is
statement.
If you see the stuff that goes, it is not
Positively
ridiculous. If you see the stuff that goes on, and all the problems we're having now, the social issues in this country, is because the children are not spending the amount of time and are not being nurtured by their parents.
Maybe it could be because
they're given to people who really don't care about them. They're getting paid minimum wage to raise somebody else's kids.
Generalizations are really easy to talk about.
Well, you just made a generalization that
know,
somehow, well, hang on. She made a generalization that somehow because unemployment and everything, people are abusing their kids more.
No, I said absolutely no such thing.
Let's Sarah weigh in here.
Absolutely no such thing.
You made an analogy that child
Hold
abuse
on,
and
let
neglect was
Sarah,
going
hey,
on.
Frank,
Are you
let Sarah speak.
able to just contain yourself for 2 seconds while
Let
someone
Sarah-
else speaks?
Sure, go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. The correlation between what people earn in jobs, many of the people who need those child care subsidies are working people. They're not people sponging off the government, as some would characterize it. They're not people who are shirking their duties or outsourcing their children to the Democratic Party. I know you enjoy the hyperbole of life, but I think if we can look at real life situations, real life families and children, and I'm glad for your family that you were able to make those decisions and it worked for you. It doesn't work for everyone. So putting it in the context of what worked for the Antonori family is not something that I think goes across everyone.
Let me ask Vince to weigh in here, because I think in a lot of cases you have a lot of single moms who don't have a husband in the house.
That's exactly what.
Point, though. That is exactly what's
Here's the
making my
issue.
point.
The issue that Frank doesn't account for, and I came from a family where we were fortunate enough to have a similar situation to Frank's, and I'm very proud of that. But not everyone can do that. And in reality, if you look at the numbers, if you look at single parent households, particularly women, single women who are working 1, sometimes 2 jobs just to make ends meet. It's not a situation where they can say, oh, you know what, I'm going to just be a stay-at-home mom. I'm going to make it somehow. I'm going to stop being poor, like Paul Ryan at the federal level likes to push, saying like that's some sort of magical cleansing words, just stop being poor. It doesn't happen. These people are hurting, they're hurting economically, and when you don't look at the whole picture, when someone has to make that decision, do I leave my kids with the neighbor? Do I leave my kids with a relative that maybe I don't know that well, just so I can make money to feed them food? Those are the kinds of issues that do arise, and you have to look at this budget in the whole picture. So when you carve it out, and it's months now since the fiasco that came to light with the scandal with CPS, and they have not addressed it, and they're going to kick the can out to a special session without addressing the true budgetary constraints that we have as a state, I think that is an abdication of duty. The other part of this, on the education side, and I'm going to weigh in what was mentioned by both of these, on the education side, meanwhile, the Republican Party is slowly trying to dismantle through defunding public education by giving away these vouchers, welfare vouchers. So Frank on one hand wants to say no to subsidies, but yet what we have is we have Huppenthal, the state superintendent of public education, shilling for private schools so we can give your hard-earned taxpayer dollars to private entities. That's not the way private enterprise is supposed to work, but yet we're going to give our taxpayer dollars and dismantle the funding for public education more and more with these welfare education voucher programs. And that's the sleeper issue of this session, because it's still out there. They've been shy because of what happened with the public outcry with respect to Senate Bill 1062. People are looking, and the eyes of the world and certainly even Republicans, not necessarily your brand of Republican, Frank, but Republicans across the state are looking at the legislature saying, where are our priorities? We're not dealing with CPS, And here we are, the first bill we're sending to the governor is this stuff about, religious issues.
I'm glad you brought up education because I want to move on to maybe a less controversial topic, Common Core, excuse me. And that was something that was a big issue this session, and there was no funding for that initially in the Senate budget. It's been put in there apparently through these negotiations with the governor's office, but there were several bills that tried to eliminate the Common Core testing program, and the Democrats teamed up with some of Frank's favorite Republicans up there in the Senate to kill those bills. And Frank, what's the big beef over Common Core?
Okay, if you look at the way the system is set up, we live in a federalist-based government where the states provide limited powers to the federal government, and then the states are the regulatory entity for the governments within their state. Local control, by the definition of our Constitution, is the state. That's the reality. So when you have a federal government that comes in and starts telling every state with a cookie-cutter approach to education that this is the way you're going to educate your kids, you're going to get a pushback, and that's what you're getting. What is really surprising is the amount of pushback that I've been seeing from a lot of school teachers and administrators about these same standards and high-stakes testing that goes in with this. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think people want to make decisions with regard to their children's education at the local level. They don't want some guy 3,000 miles away in D.C. telling them what their kid needs to be educated. And I think that you see that pushback from both sides. They don't like the federal government screwing up. They screwed the healthcare system up in this country. They'll do a hell of a job with the education system.
Vince, I have heard concerns from people on the left, school teachers, the whole idea that Common Core does push too much of the teaching to the test education standards. But your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I tend to agree. Things ought to be decided locally. So I agree with that philosophical point. But the issue that I see that many teachers and many Democrats have are not with the idea of having standards. We all want standards. We all want high standards. We want a nation of excellence. We want to continue being a nation of excellence and a state of excellence. The problem is what you have is that the standardized testing that is used it's worse than the Ames test, and it becomes an inflexible situation where teachers feel bound to just teach to this little test rather than teaching to, let's say, little Frank's potential, right? You want to teach just to the test, get that through, and at the end, you don't really have good assessment tools. So I agree a little bit with what he's saying just about local control, but which I find with a big degree of irony, because what you have at the state capitol in Arizona is the Arizona majority party, Republican Party, taking away local control wherever they can. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
It's not the same, though.
They're doing it in everything from chickens, saying cities can't have zoning ordinances to make sure that there's like an agricultural zone where you can have chickens. They're taking away everything from the cities, and it's happening. It's happening across this state, whether it's gun restrictions that they're, over here at gun shows at the TCC, to chicken ordinances. The state is stepping in and saying, we don't believe in local control unless it's the federal government.
You ran for Attorney General a couple years ago. You know that patchwork laws that are different in every jurisdiction create a nightmare for attorneys, a nightmare for judges, nightmares for prosecutors, and that there is a requirement in our state constitution, as you know, to have a uniform standard that's easy for everybody in the state to abide by. You can't have 90 million different little serfdoms of cities and Greek city-states.
Actually, that's not true. You can, and cities have done that for years. It's been a system of our towns, cities, counties. That's been our system of government.
It creates nightmares for chickens. Sarah, I want to weigh in here on the Common Core. It does seem as though the business community wants to see these standards imposed.
Yes.
The governor is behind these standards. She's changed the name of them, but the standards remain the same.
Right, and if I could just swing back to the discussion quickly that you guys were having about uniformity and standards and everyone playing by the same kind of guidelines, I think that's a really good analogy for the Common Core, because it's not the federal government saying you have to teach XYZ book or math problem or anything like that. It's a level of standards. In second grade, what do you need to know? In high school, what do you need to know? And it's that uniformity that the business community is in favor of, because people move around a lot. I mean, you're a military man. You moved all over from state to state to state. People move, and so if you're in Arizona and you move to Georgia, why should there be entirely different things that you're learning in one place versus another? So the Common Core isn't, you have to read these books. It is, these are the standards. You figure out local school districts, how you're going to do that. And so I think your point about the uniformity and the standards is a good analogy to understand Common Core and why the business people communities are supporting it, because it does offer some level of consistency. Maybe not right now in the rollout, but that is the plan, that is the goal.
Let me ask just, Frank, about this whole budget process. It really seems to have been done behind closed doors. There hasn't been much opportunity for the public to comment, state agencies to present their proposals to the Appropriations Committee. Did you see any problem with the process?
Well, I missed something here. Last year, I recall somebody that poofed the budget out of nowhere, didn't put it through any of the committees, didn't go through approps, didn't go anywhere, ran it straight to the floor and voted it out. That was the Democrat budget with the handful of turncoat Republicans that basically voted for that last year. There was no transparency, none.
Right.
I didn't hear anybody here screaming about that.
And this has been a process that has been going for a long time.
It went through
We've
the
seen
standard,
this happening.
but it went through the standard process.
Is it a good situation to be having these budgets that do not have as much transparency as perhaps they had in the past?
The bills were introduced. The bills went through the Appropriations Committee. They went through Committee of the Whole. They were voted out of the Senate. They're going to go to the House. They're going to go through Appropriations. They're going to go to Committee of the Whole. They're going to get voted out of the House. You've got 2 weeks. The last budget we had last year went down in 1 day, Jim, 1 day. There was no committee hearings. The governor usurped the normal legislative process, brought, in my opinion, a budget in outside of the legislature, into the legislature, and conspired with Democrats and a handful of Republicans to basically totally cut everybody out and pass it in the dark of night. And then not only that, Jim, they cut off debate on the floor. Republicans that were voting for this were being asked questions by their own colleagues, and they refused to answer. Democrats were asked to explain some of the provisions in the budget, and they refused to answer. If you're ever talking about a period of lack of transparency, that example was last year, not this year.
Your thoughts on the
I think
process?
that every year that the process should have transparency. I think those issues, I agree wholeheartedly, should not happen like that, and it shouldn't have happened that way this year. Some states actually require that there be public hearings where there be actual input into the process, and I frankly think we ought to have a constitutional amendment that make it be the first item of business that needs to be taken care of. And the reason I say that is that the less time that the Arizona Legislature is in session, the safer the Arizona residents are. And that's the one good thing about this budget process.
I agree with 100% with
Sarah, your thoughts on the transparency issues and the way these budgets, and maybe a decade ago we saw a lot more of hearings and opportunities for people to weigh in on what the opportunity, how the budget was being built.
Right, and I think that the budget process can't be too transparent. Any system or any budget that is crafted, no matter what party, or players behind closed doors and then just sort of here it is, let's talk about it and then we're done, can't be a good budget. Another problem, and I don't know if this is feasible or not, but traveling, I mean, Arizona's a big state. We have a lot of rural area. Everything happens at the Capitol. Yes, you can interact with your representative, your senator, but it's kind of a burden for people from outside Maricopa County to have to travel to the Capitol and testify. So, and make their points and opinions known in ways that aren't necessarily friendly to people who have 9-to-5 jobs. So I think that might be something to look at also. I don't know how feasible that is, but I think it's an idea that can't come too soon if we really are serious about this is a budget, this is a state enterprise, and it's something that affects everyone in the state. And the more voices and the more interaction you have, the better.
Now, Frank, it looks like they're going to wrap up relatively soon at the legislature. Is Andy Tobin, the Speaker of the House, eager to see this wrap up so that he can get out on the campaign
But
trail?
every other member of the legislature, and I spoke to 2 of them today, they're eager to get out of there as well. They all have elections coming up.
And he's running for Congress.
He's running for Congress, but every single member of the House and Senate's running too. And a lot of them are fortunately facing some pretty stiff primaries that I'm looking forward to being involved with as well.
You've endorsed Tobin over Adam Quasman and the rancher out there. Why do you like Tobin?
And Andy just has the experience I think that district needs to represent it well in Washington, D.C. Quasman just doesn't have the wherewithal in the background to basically deal with the politics of Washington, D.C. He will get it handed to him if he goes up there. And Tobin, I think, is a bright enough guy that can handle that up there.
And Vince, Ann Kirkpatrick is the candidate. Whoever comes out of that primary will be running against the incumbent congresswoman there. Does she have something to worry about in a midterm election in a district that was competitive 2 years ago, and you have the lower turnout on Democratic side typically in a midterm election?
I would say if it were any other time in the state of Arizona, I would be worried because it's a known statistical fact that usually the party in control of the White House has a difficult time in the midterm elections. And that's because the Congress doesn't necessarily control what the administration is doing, but they get the blowback and they face the voters on a 2-year basis. But Ann has been out there working hard with her constituents, voting on the right way up in Congress. And the more important side of this is who's coming out on the Republican side. I don't think it's going to be Andy Tobin. You know, going down to the cowboy store and buying a hat and then wearing that to all kinds of events, it just shows a true lack of authenticity. And he's facing a tough primary from a real rancher, somebody who's out there roping cattle, who's a self-made man. And the other part about Andy Tobin is that he's already shown that he couldn't even produce a budget for the House of Representatives as is constitutionally required. So I think he's a sitting duck out there for this in the primary, and I don't think he comes out of the primary.
I know, Frank, you want to weigh in, but we only have 3 minutes, and I want to get to these local issues. So that, Sarah, the city of Tucson looks like it's moving forward, possibly with a plan for downtown hotel. Yes. The developer there is asking for a subsidy, basically a loan from the city to help build the parking garage portion. It gets paid back to the people who park there. A good deal for the city of Tucson. I
think it could be. I think the city council has said we need, let's do the economic indicator studies and the research. We need to see what that has to come out, how that comes out, obviously. But I think the revitalization of downtown is definitely underway. I'm reserving judgment on this particular deal right now, but I think it's something that you need to give them credit, at least for thinking about things, but they have to be smarter about it than how they've been in the past.
All right, Frank, we're down to 2 minutes. Your thoughts on this downtown hotel deal?
Well, when I was up there, myself and Jonathan Payton pushed for downtown hotel and a convention center because you need it in order to bring the kind of business and convention business that you want into downtown. So I think they need a hotel. I'm just hoping they don't leave taxpayers holding the bag. So as long as there's private investment like it was supposed to be under the Rio Nuevo law that was passed back in late 1998, 1999. I hope they fulfill that and have private investment and not leave the taxpayers holding the bag. But I look forward to seeing what they come up with.
And Vince, I want to shift over to the county actually here with the Pima Animal Care Center. The County Board of Supervisors voted to ask voters to approve a $22 million bond to try to build a new facility for the animals out there. Good idea?
Well, I think it will probably pass. If they put it out there, people love cats, pets, puppies, kittens, and there certainly is a need for the space. I personally think that in addition to that, if they're going to have something like that, they really ought to be out there enforcing these laws against puppy mills. We ought to increase and stiffen the penalties for those sorts of institutions and have more personal responsibility so we don't have to deal with this animal care issue. But I'm a little worried about the taxpayer subsidies for whether it be a hotel or for these big projects. Really have to carefully evaluate.
20 seconds left,
That
Frank.
idea.
Your idea.
$10,000 for every dog and cat. Do you really want to pay $10,000 for a cat condo or a dog condo? That's what $22 million breaks down.
Condos.
I drive to work every day. I see people living in tents out in the desert. Maybe the Bleeding Heart liberals might build a little affordable housing for some homeless folks rather than paying $22 million for dogs and cats.
10 seconds left, Sarah.
Voters get to
Spay
vote,
and neuter
Frank.
your pets, I think, would fix a lot of the problems that we're having with animal overpopulation, and I'm not even going to bother addressing Frank's comment.
Okay.
It's true. $10,000 per dog and cat. That's ridiculous.
We are out of time. We're going to have to leave it there, but I'd like to thank you all for what was a very lively conversation here this afternoon, and we will be right back with some closing thoughts. That's our show for today, but you can learn more about politics by visiting news.azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Jim Nitzel. Thanks for watching another edition of AZ Illustrated Politics.